Um, we've all learned, um, we've all learned the powers of lies, and we've also learned the fact and falsehood in the age of Trump and long before it. Now, um, now originally this essay was put out about 4 years ago, and it was rewritten. Um, Basically, and it was reposted the same month on Salam, but spurred by the wave of reminiscence and revelation surrounding the first anniversary of the January 6th Klan Capitol attack. Basically, the guy that wrote the article retrieved this piece from the files and he read it again and rewrote it. And when he did, he was stunned by how much truer and more troubling the words that he wrote then um, and now were different. Nearly 3.5 years later. Yes, Donald Trump has been out of office for over a year, but instead of fading into the past, his war on truth has only continued to gain ground. His enablers are more subservient, and his challengers, to all appearances, are less effective. And because his lies now are aimed directly at destroying public trust in U.S. elections, the issue that was not yet prominent in 2018, they represent a much graver threat to our fundamental democratic process and values. Those realities lead us to think that the observations and analysts and the recollections of some moments long before the Trump era that taught significant lessons about the horror of lies, they may have something meaningful to offer now, but appears here in lightly edited form to acknowledge the passage of time. And it's easy and not wrong to think that truth is in dire danger in the era of Donald Trump. His own record of issuing breathtaking falsehoods from the exalted platform of the White House is unprecedented in American history, and so is his consistent refusal to back down when a statement is proven to be false. Um, in Trump in Trump's world, those who expose his lies are the liars, and facts that show he was wrong are fake news. In this war on truth, Trump has several important allies, and one is the shameful silence of the Republican politicians who don't challenge his misstatements for fear of giving offense to his true believing base. Another is a media environment far more cluttered and chaotic than in past decades, making it easier for people to find stories that fit their preconceived ideas and screen out those that they prefer not to believe. These trends come in the context of a more general loosening of the informal rules that once put some limits on the tone and content of political speech. American politicians have always done plenty of exaggerating, lying by omission, selecting misleading facts, and using slanted language. And typically, though, if not always, they try to avoid the outright provable lies which it was commonly assumed would be politically damaging if exposed. Nowadays, the cost of being caught lying seems less obvious, but now with the politicians, they show no apparent embarrassment about fucking lying at all. But take, for instance, Corey Stewart, the Republican candidate trying to unseat Virginia's Democratic Senator Tim Kaine back in the 2018 midterms. Stewart basically unapologetically told the Washington Post about a doctored photograph his campaign distributed. Of course, it was fucking photoshopped. In the altered photo, the image it shows an image of a much younger Kaine is sliced in to make it appear that he is sitting with a group of the armed Central American guerrillas. The caption of the picture says, "Tim Kaine worked in Honduras to promote his radical socialist ideology," suggesting that the photo proves that he consorted with the violent revolutionaries while working at a Jesuit mission in Honduras during the start of the 1980s. In reality, the guerrillas in the original photograph, which dates from well after Kaine's time in Central America, were not leftists and they were not in Honduras, but they were the right wing Contra insurgents in Nicaragua. So the visual was a double fake, putting Kaine in a scene he wasn't even in, and then falsely describing the scene. And when I read the story, I wondered whether Stewart would think it would be legitimate if an opponent photoshopped him into a picture of American Nazis brandishing the swastika flags. If anyone asked him that question, we have not found a record of it. Now, it may still be uncommon for a politician to acknowledge a deception as forthrightly as Stewart did, but it does seem that politicians today feel and probably are freer to lie than they used to be. Um, truth is facing a serious crisis in the present moment. But two things are worth remembering. First, that crisis did not begin with Donald Trump; it has a long history. And second, and possibly more sobering, truth may be more fragile and lies more powerful than most of us, journalists included, would like to believe that. And that means the wounds Trump and his sycophants have inflicted, on top of earlier ones, might prove harder to heal than we all think. Now, the early lesson is we began learning about the fragility of truth many years ago. George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, had taught an early lesson in the spring of 1964, less than a year after his notorious stand in the schoolhouse door attempt. He blocked two black students from enrolling at the University of Alabama, and he came to Maryland as a candidate in the Democratic presidential primary, and not to be confused with his more widely remembered presidential runs in 68 and 72. His real target wasn't the presidential nomination, but the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was then filibustered in the Senate. There were plenty of segregationist Democrats in Maryland back then, and Wallace calculated that scoring a significant vote there, as well as in a couple of other states, would send a message to Senate Democrats that supporting civil rights was politically perilous. At the time, um, Arnold Isaacs was 23 at the time, and during that spring, barely halfway through the second year as a reporter, he was assigned to the very junior half of the Baltimore Sun two-man team covering the primary campaign. It was under the direction of the Sun's political chief reporter, who was an old-timer named Charlie Whiteford, but Charlie didn't hog all the big stories as would have happened on most newspapers, but in an effort to show balanced and even-handed reporting, an appearance that the Sun in those days went to extreme lengths to maintain, he switched off with Arnold, so that by his beeline in mind, it would appear alternately over stories about each candidate. As a result, Young and Green was what Isaac was. I got to cover Wallace's rallies on a roughly equal basis with his senior colleague. Now, from the start, basically, he heard Arnold Isaacs had heard that the governor saying things about the civil rights bill that weren't just misleading or slanted in ways he was already accustomed to hearing, even though that early in his reporting, but it was unequivocally false. For example, he regularly warned his cronies that homeowners would be sent to prison for refusing to sell or rent to African Americans. In fact, the 1964 law did not mention housing at all. After the first rally that Isaacs attended, he got a copy of a bill from the Sun's library, and he carried it with him for the rest of the campaign, so he could accurately cite Wallace's misstatements as he was typing up the stories. Now, the first time he nailed his lies in print, basically, Isaacs was smug. Maybe he can get away with this stuff in Alabama, but I remember thinking, the Baltimore Sun will keep him straight to Maryland, but very soon, I found out that I couldn't have been more wrong. The people Wallace was speaking to believed him, and not from the Sun, and Wallace knew that. He didn't care in the least what he wrote, about what Isaacs wrote about him, and kept right on offering his untruths about the Civil Rights Bill. More than a half century has passed since we learned that lesson, and it's still sobering. When people like a politician's lies better than they like the truth, it's tough to change their minds, and even after lies are proven false, they remain a powerful force in the public. Now we're learning another lesson that's far from home. Now go 13 years later, in a factory on the other side of Earth, we had another moment of truth that taught what might be even more chilling lesson. Lies can still have power even when we know they're lies. And the moment came during Isaac's first trip to China back in 1977, 8 months after the death of that country's leader, Mao Zedong, as the Sun's correspondent in Hong Kong. It was still under British rule at the time. Isaacs had been writing about the Chinese affairs for nearly 4 years, but that visit 7 days in and around the city of Guangzhou, which is then commonly called Canton, was the first time I was able to look with my own eyes at a country that was still largely closed to the outside world. On those days, the minders took me to the Guangzhou heavy machinery plant, which manufactured equipment for oil refineries, chemical and metallurgical factories, and other industrial facilities. Its walls were plastered with posters showing standard images of Chairman Mao and of all his soldiers, workers, and peasants that were heroically struggling to realize his socialist ideals. The scene I saw from a catwalk over the factory floor, however, looked nothing like those melodramatic images. The few workers that were tending machines or trundling wheelbarrows across the floor, but most were standing around idly, sipping tea, chatting in small groups, or reading the newspapers. Basically, I was startled by that very unheroic scene, and even more startled when it dawned on me why I was so fucking surprised. It wasn't discovering that those propaganda images were false. We knew that already, but instead, we realized that even knowing that then, we still had unconsciously expected to see workers looking like men and women shown on those posters, faces glowing with devotion, while given their all to carry out Chairman Mao's revolutionary line. Until that fucking moment, I would have said that with absolute certainty, certainty that I was immune to such Chinese propaganda. We had seen too many of its crude falsifications, such as the doctored photographs of Mao's funeral that had run only months earlier in the same publication that regularly showed those heroic workers. Um, Mao's widow, Jiang Qing, and her three principal associates, and had been in the front row of mourners when the photos were taken. Only a couple weeks later, they were arrested and denounced as counter-revolutionary criminals. The Chinese media kept on publishing those funeral photos, but with Jiang and her allies, which are now labeled the Gang of Four, they were airbrushed out. Blurred smudges on blank spots appeared where they had been shown in the originals, while vertical rows of the X's blotched out their names in the captions. Had anyone asked about the retouching, it's a safe bet that Chinese authorities would have answered with the 1976 equivalent. Of course, they were fucking photoshopped. Now having seen those and so many other transparently false words and images, I could not believe I would ever confuse any official Chinese lies with reality. Still, there was on that. Still there. Isaacs was on that factory catwalk, and he was stunned to realize that those fucking propaganda images had shaped what I expected to see, even though I knew perfectly well that they were not real. And that moment too taught me a lasting lesson that truth could be a fragile thing, and not just in the outside world, but inside my mind and memory. Um, Now, by these recollections from 40 to 50 years ago, Isaacs didn't mean to suggest that there's nothing new about the immediate crisis, but it's quite the fucking opposite. Trump's outlandish untruthfulness, an increasingly chaotic media landscape, and the decline of traditional habits of political speech unquestionably represent a new and deeply alarming threat to the public discourse and the foundations of a democratic government. Now, one element of that crisis might be considered analogous to what doctors call an immunodeficiency illness, a disease that destroys or weakens the body's ability to cure or control its symptoms. The immunodeficiency disease in today's political and cultural wars is the campaign to undermine public trust in journalists and other watchdogs, the very people who are supposed to counter the fake facts with real ones. Um, the campaign isn't new. Attacks on news organizations, most prominently from the right, but also from the left, go back to at least the 1960s under Trump. However, that assault has become uglier and more intense and more fucking dangerous. The calling journalists enemies of the American people, for example, doesn't just raise echoes of past totalitarian regimes. It gives aid and cover to the present-day officials and lawmakers who want to avoid being publicly held accountable for their acts. That applies not just in the United States, but internationally. Trump's anti-media rhetoric abates the repressive rulers across the world who suppress independent critical reporting in their countries. A recent column by the Washington Post's Jackson Deal had documented the worldwide impact of Trump's anti-media assault. He reported that his search for examples turned up 28 countries where the terms fake news or false news have been used to attack the legitimate journalists and truthful reporting during Trump's time in office. Now, around the world, Deal found that authoritarian leaders like Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines and Cambodia's Sun Hen and Turkey's Recep Erdogan have explicitly endorsed American president attacks or echoed his exact words while cracking down on press freedom in their own countries. Now, journalists have responded to Trump without pouring of indignant commentary and understandable reaction, though it's far from clear whether it helps or hurts the cause. A gesture like the Boston Globe's initiative that led more than 300 newspapers across the country to publish editorials on the same day calling for freedom of the press and attacking Trump's stance in the media had raised valid challenges to the president's charges, or the squatter at the time, but also it may have cemented in place a kind of equivalency in the public mind. Trump is against journalists, and journalists are against Trump. Beyond any reasonable doubt, that equivalency um, reinforces Trump's side more than it depends on good reporting or strengthening the public um hold on public knowledge. Sorry, for his sycophants, it validates his posturing as squatter that was besieged by hostile media, and his repeated insistence that stories he doesn't like are fake news, but the pious editorials declaring journalists devotion to truth and fervently exalting the First Amendment may be justified, but as a practical matter, eloquent self-righteousness seems unlikely to be an effective weapon in the war against the war on truth. Now, now it would be nice to think that tougher, more factual reporting would be more helpful, but as we've learned covering the Wallace campaign all those years, that it has its limits too. Now, we couldn't read George Wallace's mind in 1964, and we can't read Donald Trump's mind 54 years later. So what follows is speculation, and not verifiable fact with that qualifier. The impression is that Trump's falsehoods come from a different place and have a different character than Wallace's. If there's a Wallace reincarnation on the landscape today, it would be someone like Corey Stewart, and Wallace might not have said it to a reporter, though I did sometimes sense an unseen wink in our direction when he delivered some outrageous statement. But we strongly suspect that, of course, it was photoshopped, adjusted for the different technology of that era, and it exactly reflected his attitude. And Trump looks like a quite different case. He clearly lies consciously at times, but generally the style and content of his falsehoods give the impression that he has engaged in the kind of internal mental photoshopping, reshaping facts inside his mind until they conform to something that he wants to say at a given moment. Now, a recent report in the Daily Beast described an episode that fits remarkably well with this theory. It was told by the Daily Beast's Asewin Subsang at a March 2017 White House meeting between the squatter and representatives of the leading veterans organizations. Rick Weedman of the Vietnam Veterans of America had brought up the subject of Agent Orange, the widely used U.S. defoliant that has had long term health effects on American soldiers and the Vietnamese villagers. As Subsang reconstructed the discussion, Trump responded by asking if Agent Orange was that stuff in the movie. He was referencing the 1979 film Apocalypse Now. Several veterans in the room tried to explain to the squatter that the scene he remembered involved napalm, an incendiary agent, not Agent Orange, but Trump wouldn't back down. And Subsang recounted and proceeded to say things like, "No, I think it's that stuff from that movie." His comment directly to Weidman was, "I think you just don't like the movie." And what makes the Daily Beast report particularly revealing is not just that Trump is fucking ignorant of the facts, but he would not listen to people who clearly knew better than him. And that behavior is all too familiar to anyone even casually aware of Trump's record. The argument with the veterans was different because his misstatement did not arise from any of the usual reasons. He was not answering a critic or tearing down someone who frustrated him or making him an argument for policy or defending some past statement. Sticking to his version of Agent Orange was purely a reflection of his personality, but on a subject one can safely assume he had not thought about until that moment. He seized on a fragmentary memory of something he had seen on a screen years earlier, and he jumped to a wrong conclusion, and was then immediately convinced that he was correct solely because he had heard himself saying it, and not only certain that he was wrong, but he was oblivious to the fact that everyone he was talking to knew more about the subject than he did. In effect, this story strongly suggests that Trump's thought process, if you can call it that, it boils down to I am right because I am always right, which we know that technically it should be titled the thing should boil down to that Trump, I am always wrong, because he's like, basically it should be titled I am wrong because I am always wrong, and that's technically Trump. Lots of people absorb facts selectively and adapt them to fit opinions that they already hold. And that's human nature, basically. But Trump's ability to twist the truth, consciously or not, is extreme. So apparently, an unshakable conviction that no matter what the subject is, no one knows more than he does, even if he doesn't know anything about it. Which means he has no need to listen to anyone who tries to correct his lies. In a person with his power and responsibilities, those qualities are truly fucking frightening. As alarming as his record is, and though it would be a serious mistake to think of Trump as the only or even the principal enemy of truth and truth tellers, There is a large army out there training out false information, using technology that lets them spread their messages to a mass audience with minimal effort and expense. But the largest threat to truth that we see here is not from the liars and truth twisters, but from deep in our collective and individual human nature. It's the same threat that we glimpsed all those years ago at George Wallace's rallies in Maryland and on that factory floor in China. The tendency to believe comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable truths, and to trust our own assumptions instead of looking at the evidence that we see in front of us. The widespread and deep-rooted failure of critical thinking in American society today has helped make Trump and his enablers, like the other liars before them, successful in the war against truth. In the words of the mid-20th century cartoonist Walter Kelly's comic strip character Pogo the Possum, we have met the enemy, and it is us. And that's a fucking powerful enemy. Whether there's an effective way for the forces of truth to oppose it, it is far from clear. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And thanks for listening.